Welcome to Raptors Weekly for the week of April the 6th. The Raptors have lost to the Celtics last night, which was not very good. Marcus Smart hitting the buzzer beater after Brad Stevens drew up quite a play. So that was kind of how the week ended. And we're not going to talk too much about that game on this podcast because there's not much to talk about. But what we do have is a special guest in the form of James Herbert from CBSSports.com, who we'll talk to momentarily. But before we get to James, let's recap the week. We talked about Boston briefly. DeMar DeRozan had a pretty good game, 38 points for him. He's coming on strong, so he's been the one positive this week that heading into the playoffs, you have to say, at least we got that going for us. We got DeMar DeRozan going for us. Prior to that, it was Brooklyn. That was disappointing, 114-109. DeRozan had a strong game, but the Raptors defense was just in shambles there, especially Greivis Vasquez, whose perimeter defense against Darren Williams or just about anybody on the Nets was woeful, and he's losing minutes to Lou Williams at this point at the 1, with Dwane Casey preferring to go with Williams instead of Vasquez. But then again, Casey went to Vasquez late in that game for offensive reasons, and the Raptors ended up taking 4 shots that were quite poor. So I don't really know how that's working out. Prior to that, it was Minnesota, and the Raptors won that one quite comfortably, 113-99. It was a blowout. Probably one of the most complete games the Raptors have played this season. The Wolves had really were out of it from the start. And before that, it was another DeMar DeRozan explosion, 42 points against the Houston Rockets. So if you see a theme here, it's DeMar DeRozan's scoring. In addition to scoring, he's also distributing the ball very well. I remember when he came back from injury, you saw him shoot poorly, but really rack up a bunch of assists. And we're seeing him do that and score at this point. So that's an extremely positive sign for the Raptors, with DeRozan playing, I'd say, his best basketball of the season right before the playoffs. So if you're looking for something positive in this, just take that away, that DeMar DeRozan is kind of playing really well. And just a quick look ahead to the schedule and the quest for 50 wins. The Raptors are at 45, and they have 5 games remaining, which means they got to win all 5. And those 5 games are on the road: Charlotte, Orlando, Miami, Boston, all on the road. And the final game of the season is on April 15th against Charlotte. That's on ESPN, actually. So the Raptors have to sweep it to get to 50 wins. I'll be honest with you, man. It doesn't look like it's going to happen. No matter what happens over the next little bit, I think there's a good chance the Raptors will face the Wizards in the playoffs, and we'll talk to James Herbert about that right after this. All right, joining me right now is James Herbert from CBSSports.com. James, of course, is a big Raptor fan because he's from Toronto. Welcome, James.
Thanks for having me. Not a fan. I'm a Raptor observer.
You're a fan. Say. You're a fan. Don't lie to yourself.
I was a fan when I was a kid. I wasn't like disappointed when the Celtics won. I was just like, oh, that was interesting. That was fun. Put it that way.
Not even deep down, like you were like, oh man, I kind of wanted my hometown team to win.
No, because I want the Celtics to make the playoffs, right? Like I don't want anything that gets the Brooklyn Nets out of the playoffs. I just don't want to watch them anymore. Mm-hmm. So for me, I'm rooting for the Celtics to win every game. I want the Nets to lose every game. Miami can win, Indiana, Charlotte, I don't care. I just don't want the Nets. And I really actually like the Celtics team a lot. So I was kind of happy. Sorry to say that, but I was kind of happy when the Celtics pulled that out, even though it kind of felt bad for the Raptors because DeRozan had that amazing game and they just kind of wasted it.
Yeah. I see you made a lot of friends in the first 30 seconds of this podcast.
Yeah, people are going to love me.
Yeah. So let's talk about
Celtics.
Let's talk about hate watching a little bit of Miami, Brooklyn, Washington, Toronto. Who's the team that you hate the most?
That's a very easy question. It's Brooklyn.
Brooklyn? Why is that? Does it have anything to do with the whole Raptors series in the past, or is it something else?
No. I mean, that obviously if the Raptors somehow – I mean, and this is looking less and less likely, but there's an outside chance that Brooklyn could still move up and get the 6 and the Raptors could get the 3, and that could be a big storyline again, and that would probably get kind of tiresome just based on the fact that, this is a very different series than it would have been last year. and we'd have to be talking about the F Brooklyn thing and all of that stuff, which is fine. It's sort of compelling, but I'm just kind of over it. I just don't like the way they play. I don't like the offense that they run. I'm not a fan of that many of their players. They've just not been an interesting team to follow at all this season for me.
I don't know. You sound like a big Alan Anderson fan. I thought you were no.
Anderson's fine. He's a good role player. I think he's an underrated player. I think they have a few guys like that, but the sum of the parts is not interesting to me. Like, I like Anderson. I like, Markel Brown's a kind of fun rookie who jumps really high and plays defense. Like, Brook Lopez has been playing really well lately, but they're just such a blah team overall. I've thought that since the beginning of the season, and I was kind of disappointed that they didn't. I mean, they brought in Thaddeus Young, but I was kind of hoping they'd make a whole bunch of moves at the deadline and kind of blow it up, and that didn't happen, obviously.
Did you watch their Twitter feed after they beat the Raptors earlier this week? They posted like a image which had the whole Blake album handwriting. It said, "If you're reading this, the Nets won," which I thought was pretty clever.
Yeah, their social media team is up on the big stuff. That's for sure.
Let's talk Raps. The Raptors right now still have a chance to actually win 50 games if they sweep the rest of the schedule, and it's a fairly easy schedule. They might not win it. They might not get 50, but they still have a chance. And they also have a chance to set an all-time wins total. Yet, despite all that, fans just aren't happy. Like, if you read the comment section after the Celtics loss, or even after a win, people just aren't happy. They just maybe fear another first-round exit. Like, what's your take? Why are people not happy with the Raptors despite them having a phenomenal season?
I think they have reason to be upset, and there's also, you just have to look at the way the season has gone. If they started the season the way that they're finishing it, if they finished it the way that they started it, I think even if they had the exact same number of wins, it would be very different. But since they looked so fantastic in the first part of the season, November and December, putting up like the best offensive efficiency in the league, like actually historically good offensive numbers, you're not going to have fans complaining, oh, the ball isn't moving enough if they're the best offensive team in the league. And the defense wasn't as bad then. Obviously, it's taken a huge nosedive, which is weird for a Dwane Casey coach team. You got this like tough defensive-minded head coach who's been preaching defense since the moment he showed up, who is coaching one of the worst defense in the league over the past couple of months. And I think fans are frustrated by some of the stuff he's doing, some of the rotation stuff, some of the schemes, and also individual players not living up to what certain fans expected. I think obviously fans thought there was going to be another step from Terrence Ross this season. It hasn't happened. Greivis Vasquez defensively has been a huge problem, to say the least. I think two things can be true at the same time. You can say this has been a very successful season, and they have a pretty good chance of getting out of the first round of the playoffs if they end up playing the Wizards, and that's no small thing for a team that has almost never done that in their existence. So I think you can feel good about that. But at the same time, you can see, changes are going to have to be made this summer. And this has been disappointing to watch for Raptor fans based on where they raised their expectations to in November and December. And I think justifiably so, they raised those expectations.
So you mentioned Terrence Ross there. He's the guy who I guess hasn't really stepped up this season. His numbers look poor. He's almost regressed in a way. Defensively, Dwane Casey likes to put him on point guards, and we saw this week that really doesn't work because you might think that he has the length and athleticism and could maybe back off of point guards, yet prevent them from driving. But it really hasn't happened for him on either end of the court. But the other guy, Jonas Valanciunas, the other young Raptor that fans have their hopes on, he's had a pretty strong season. How much of Jonas have you watched this season, James?
I've watched almost all of the games, and I think Raptors fans should be pretty pleased with where he's at. I think, you have to keep in mind that centers generally develop pretty slowly, and he's not going to be, like Andrew Bogut defensively in terms of situational awareness and smarts and decision making on that end yet. And they're working with him. They want to get him there. I think the schemes also need to fit him a bit better. They at least have him dropping. But yeah, offensively, he's obviously grown leaps and bounds over the past few years. I think sometimes his teammates still kind of ignore him when he has position, and that can be frustrating, but he doesn't complain about it at all. I think, he's the one guy, like when you really look big picture about the Raptors, and, you can be concerned about role players here and there and how they're going to fill out the rest of the team. But if you still think that Valanciunas can be an all-star player, maybe not a franchise player, but like one of the better centers in the league, if you still think that, and I think there's reason to think he can get there, then you still have to be pretty optimistic about this team's chances in the next few years, because there just aren't a lot of players in the league that can give you 20 points a game on offense from the center position and also protect the rim. And he's nowhere near an elite rim protector yet, but I do think he has the capacity to get there. And I think Raptor fans should feel pretty good about where he's at, even if, you have to acknowledge there are some people who thought this was going to be like a huge breakout season. He might be an all-star. Like, that hasn't happened. But I think you still need to be patient with the guy.
Yeah, and you alluded to the defense. That's I think that ranked 25th in the league right now, which is not expected from a Dwane Casey coached team. The one working theory we have at RR is that the stuff that he's asking his players to do, which is essentially like help and rotate very, very aggressively, doesn't really suit the personnel that he has.
Yeah.
And that's kind of proven itself over the course of the season. Heading into the playoffs, assuming you're playing Washington or even Milwaukee, does that approach change for Dwane Casey? Does he try something different, or does he go, it got us this far, may as well stick with it?
Yeah, that's the question, right? Because you think, okay, well, maybe they should, ice pick and rolls more. Maybe they shouldn't have the big guys showing all of the time. Maybe they shouldn't be asking everybody to rotate so much and work so hard defensively. Maybe they should play a more conservative style. And I don't disagree with that. I think he is asking a lot from a team that isn't full of naturally gifted defenders or even necessarily naturally aware defenders. Because you look at James Johnson and he does some incredible athletic things defensively, but he's often, helping way off his man or having to make up for an initial mistake or something. And it doesn't mean he's a bad defender. It just, he's not – the scheme isn't necessarily working even when he's making good plays. So you say, okay, they could tweak this or that. Maybe they will make minor adjustments in the playoffs. But I think, this is April. Yeah. I don't think they're about to make any major changes from what Dwane Casey has been preaching since training camp, or really what he's been doing since the day that he got to Toronto. I would be surprised if there was a major change, and I think if that was going to happen, it should have happened a while ago. But I don't disagree with what you guys are saying about them not necessarily having the personnel to play that style, because I think you want longer guys, more athletic guys, and just honestly better defensive players than they have on their roster.
Yeah. They've conceded 117 to Boston, 114 to Brooklyn. So this is not the type of basketball you want to be playing heading into the playoffs.
No, and they have Amir Johnson used to make up for so much of the bad perimeter defense and the mistakes other guys made. And, he's been okay when he's been out there. And he's had some great games, especially when he's rested, but he hasn't been as consistent as he's been in the past, and that I think that's entirely because of health, not because he's tailed off or anything. But I do think, if anything, this should make people appreciate just how much work Amir did over the past few years defensively. Yeah.
I just don't see Amir even staying fully healthy for a 7-game series. Just that 12-day stretch. I just don't see him staying fit for that. One thing that we have noticed, the defense might be in shambles, and Greivis Vasquez, who's been getting a lot of heat over the last 3 days, and rightfully so. I think the invention of Vine really hasn't helped Vasquez, because as soon as he makes a mistake, it's already vined, and there's 20,000 loops on it, and everybody trash cares, and all that stuff's going on. It's just not helping him, because with the Twitter generation, everything's so zoomed in. You focus on every single mistake, and I'm sure if Twitter existed back when Jordan played, there would be vines of Jordan blowing defensive possessions and doing all kinds of weird shit. But just now the focus is so fine-tuned on players that people like Vasquez are getting really exposed. So we don't have to debate whether Vasquez is a bad defender. I think we all know he is. But one thing that Dwane Casey has kind of found out almost by accident over the last week or so is that Lou Williams is actually playing a capable point guard role. So if you... And also, obviously, he's also had the responsibility of bench scoring throughout the season. But if he finds that Lou Williams is doing an adequate job on at the backup point, do you see him, Casey, basically reducing Vasquez's minutes and putting Lou Will as kind of the formal backup point guard?
I would. I don't know that I see Casey doing it, though. I think you don't necessarily need a traditional point guard on this team all the time. Well, I mean, Lowry's going to come back soon. Like, I'd be surprised if he wasn't playing next game. So I think you're going to see both Lou and Vasquez's minutes go down just based on that. Yeah, if it's me, I play Lou a lot of the one, and I think he's a better defender than Vasquez is. I know he doesn't exactly have a sterling defensive reputation, but I think he generally has, he has active hands, and he'll do little things on defense that help, and he's not as blatantly giving up penetration like Vasquez does. And I think the other side of this Vasquez thing is, you're talking about going back and watching 90s basketball with Jordan. Like, if you watched those games, you'll find a lot of the time, almost all the time, point guards are guarding point guards. And based on, how quick these guys are and how athletic these guys are in the modern NBA, a lot of the time you don't see point guards guarding opposing teams' point guards, especially when they are not the most athletic guys in the world and not the quickest guys in the world. Mm-hmm. And I think when you're watching Vasquez checking these guys, it's not necessarily his fault that he can't do it. Mm-hmm. He shouldn't necessarily be asked to be guarding the Darren Williamses of the world when Williams is, the past few weeks, he's looked a lot quicker than he did earlier on in the season. He's getting into the paint against anybody. He's certainly going to be able to do that against Vasquez. They could have hidden him against Bogdanovic or whoever in that game. And I think when he is on the court, you absolutely have to hide him. You can't ask him to guard guys that are blatantly faster than him and can get into the paint at will. And it's hard to kill Vasquez for that because that's just who he is. That's not necessarily his fault. So, yeah, this is a roundabout way of answering your question. I would play Lou Williams more at the one. But I think Vasquez is still going to get his minutes. And they're probably going to think, well, in the playoffs last year, he made a bunch of shots and came up huge, and he's a big game player. And that's what, Casey was kind of saying last night after the loss. So I'd be surprised if they took him out of the rotation entirely. But he's not making a great argument for himself right now with his recent play.
Yeah, I kind of see him more really at as a 2 in the playoffs, where he's I think in the last playoffs you saw him guard like Sean Livingston, like somewhat effectively at times.
He and Lowry were a good backcourt, yeah.
So instead of him at the point facing maybe John Wall in stretches or whatever.
That's not what you want to see.
If you put him again at the 2, he has a higher chance of basically guarding Bradley Beal than he has of John Wall. He's going to suck at both, but he's going to be better at one of them.
But you can hide him on Rasul Butler on the perimeter, or on, I don't know, you don't really want him guarding Porter, but if Porter is basically standing on the perimeter anyway, then that's fine. The point is just to minimize the time when he's guarding somebody who can really just take him off the dribble, and that's what most starting point guards and even a lot of the quick backup point guards that come into the NBA are capable of easily doing against them.
Let's switch to the Wizards right now, because it looks like the Raptors are going to be facing the Wizards as the home team in the first round. As you mentioned, things might change, but really it looks like it's going to be the Wizards, a team that the Raptors have swept this season 3-0. One of them was actually a big blowout there, and 2 games were extremely close, with one of them going to OT. Now, if you recall, the 2 times you lost to the Nets in the playoffs, we had excellent regular seasons against them. I think we won the first time 3-1 and the second time 3-1 as well. This time 3-0 against Washington, but the pundits, such as Jalen Rose and so on, still pick Washington ahead of Toronto. Are you amongst them?
No, I pick Toronto. I have a hard time of being that certain of anything based on the inconsistency of the Raptors this season, and also not knowing how healthy Amir Johnson's going to be, how healthy Kyle Lowry is going to be. Those are just such huge question marks to me. But I think this team does match up well with the Wizards. I think they matched up well with them last year. Washington fans didn't want to see Toronto in the playoffs last year. That team is sort of constructed weirdly, and they're basically, the mood in that city is pretty similar to the mood in Toronto when it comes to, fans' opinions on the coach and the offense and things like that. It's probably actually worse there. But yeah, I think they don't do well with teams that can have a stretch 4 out there. So I think Patterson becomes absolutely huge against them, just like he was in the Nets in last year's playoffs. I don't think you can count on the Raptors containing John Wall necessarily, but I do think that offense is not what it could be based on the talent that they have. So I think even if the Raptors defense is not good, if it can just get to mediocre and not like it's been for the past couple of months, then the Wizards and their kind of, I don't know, like mid-90s style NBA offense could help Toronto out a little bit.
Well, that's what the Raptors offense is as well, right? I mean, we talk about that, like with the modern offenses of the NBA, the Golden States and the ball movement, San Antonio offense. The Raptors and Wizards are extremely similar in their offensive styles. Like they're not an up and down court. They're not like heavily reliant on ball movement. It's very much individualistic play, which gets both teams going. So in that sense, they're very similar.
Yeah, I think I have more problems with the way Washington plays because I think a lot of the Raptors stuff is personnel driven. I think they have a bunch of guys that are really good at scoring in ISO. I understand the frustration with it. It's not the prettiest thing in the world all the time, but I think they generally do try to be unselfish on the team. It's just not necessarily the most aesthetically pleasing style. I think in Washington, the situation's a bit worse. I think if you just look at how Beal's been used, he's a guy that I think in a different system would put up huge numbers. And we've seen him even in that system have games where you're like, okay, this guy can be a star. But I don't think he's being used optimally. But yeah, I mean, there are similarities. Neither team is the Hawks, that's for sure. But I think the Raptors the easy thing to do is just look at the numbers. Like the Raptors are obviously a much better offensive team than Washington is, even if they both are kind of ISO heavy.
So let's talk about the Raptors and the ISO heavy comment that you made. So over the last 3 or 4 games, you've seen the Raptors, and even over the past couple of weeks, you've seen the Raptors hang with the Bulls twice, but really fade in the fourth quarter. And this idea of ISO offense kind of seems to work for the first 3 quarters, but in the fourth quarter, when defenses sort of lock in and the Raptors become a little predictable, though, it's going to go to DeMar DeRozan. He's going to dribble it a few times, dribble handoff on the left. He's going to probe and probably take a jumper. It becomes that much easier to guard. And we've seen that over the last week. The Raptors offense has become that much more predictable the deeper the game goes on. Do you think Lowry coming back and maybe Johnson coming back changes that, or is that something the Wizards can actually use against the Raptors?
I think both. Lowry coming back changes everything, and I think the Raptors are at their best when they're playing freely and Lowry is making decisions and running a lot of pick and rolls, and they're making simple plays and trying to get shots in transition. When they don't look like they're running a play, they are the best, and that's true for most teams. But I think that's extra true for Toronto. At the same time, it's not that you can't run in the playoffs, because we've seen, especially over the past few years, that you definitely can. But scouting improves in the playoffs, so games tend to slow down because teams know what you're going to do, and Washington can lock in on what Toronto's plays are and kind of take their pet plays away. And you saw Brooklyn do that last season, and then they're going to be a little coaching chess match as the series goes on, like there is with every series. And I think the fact that they are a pretty predictable team can definitely hurt them. They're not necessarily going to put up the same numbers offensively in the playoffs as they did in the regular season. But I think the exact same thing can be said for Washington. I think they are not exactly the most imaginative offensive team either. So it kind of goes both ways. But yeah, I do think ideally for Toronto, they will have Lowry back and playing like the superstar that he played like in November and December. And there is less, a lot of the offense has been saved by DeMar playing hero ball and playing it well. And while that's nice, sometimes it is harder to do in pressure situations. The one other thing that I do want to say is, in the fourth quarter, sometimes it is definitely hard to score against a set defense in the fourth quarter, especially on ISO. But I think a lot of their fourth quarter troubles have been on the other end too.
Yeah, the other end we've kind of beaten to death through every single podcast, and we don't really have a solution for that. But I do want to ask you about the coaching matchup here, Randy Wittman versus Dwane Casey. To me, this might be the only playoff matchup where Dwane Casey, you could say, has a clear advantage over his opponent. No offense to Randy Wittman, but I do think Dwane Casey...
You sure you don't mean no offense to Randy Wittman?
No, I do think... I'm a Casey fan in the sense that I think he's administered somewhat of a culture change in Toronto. He's changed the feel. People hate his X's and O's, no doubt. His substitution patterns are weird, and we've talked about them. Jonas Valanciunas, we talked about earlier. But I do think against Wittman, he could hold the advantage. And even though we lost the Celtics game, Casey had a pretty good coaching game where he made the key substitutions, played offense, defense. Unfortunately for him, Brad Stevens pulled one on him, but he had a decent coaching game. So if you're a Raptor fan, don't be too scared of Dwane Casey against the Wizards, because he might actually be the better coach.
I think if you're a Raptor fan and you're worried about the coaching matchup, pull up a Wizards blog. Or a Twitter feed of a Wizards blogger or fan, and just go through any of the recent games. That's all you have to do if you're worried about the coaching matchup, because the sort of quote unquote controversy here, or like whatever, like I'm not sure that Casey is actually in any danger of losing his job, but fans talk about it, but it is nothing compared to what is happening in Washington. Nothing.
So one guy we just kind of alluded to, Patrick Patterson. If you had asked me pick the key to a series here, other than obviously Lowry returning, I'd say Patrick Patterson, because the guy, number one, he's one of the hardest working players the Raptors have. Even though he's somewhat undersized at the 4 or 5, he works his ass off, hits the glass, is extremely diligent in his rotations, and really the work effort here is incredible on Patrick Patterson's part. Against the Celtics, he missed a lot of wide open threes, and that's the one beef you have with him. Like, he's shooting 37% from 3 this year, but he's the type of guy you really want having good offensive games in the playoffs, because he adds that much of another dimension to the Raptors, because once he's hitting his threes, the floor is stretching much more. He's got a mid-range game. You can play him in pick and roll. He can actually beat his man off the dribble. He's got a pull-up game. His offensive arsenal, I feel, has been underutilized throughout the season. And if you compare this season to half a season last year he was with the Raptors, I would say he's taken a step back because his role in the offense has diminished. His individual numbers, 3-point percentage, might be higher, but I think he's actually taken a step back, and he's not as great of a part of an offense as he was last year. Talking about the importance of Patrick Patterson, especially against the Wizards, who could struggle to guard a guy like him?
I think he's extremely important, especially if it's the Wizards, because they've struggled guarding guys like him all year. They've struggled guarding any lineup that is stretchy, and he's the guy that does that for the Raptors. And yeah, you could talk about maybe he should be doing more. I mean, I know he spent a lot of time trying to add stuff to his game last year, and he works on that floater a lot, and he wants to do more stuff off the dribble. But just based on his role on the team, he's playing off of the other guys, and that's just kind of how it is. This is not an equal opportunity offense. This is not so much of a – I mean, the guys are obviously making reads, and it's not like they're calling a set play every single time down. And I think you do see him. He's one of the guys that does look better when it's a little bit more free flowing. But I do think, and most times he's going to be on the perimeter, stretching the floor, and kind of making the game easier for the other guys. And if it gets kicked out to him, he'll shoot it. And he's had stretches this year when he's been absolutely on fire from downtown. He's had slumps, and I think, based on whether or not he is shooting the ball well in that series, that could easily swing how it goes. But I think just the mere fact that he gets minutes in that series and plays a lot is important, because you at least have to guard him out there. And, we've seen Amir Johnson make 3-pointers when he has 5 seconds to wind it up and release it, but he's obviously not going to get the attention out there that Patterson does by any means. I think he's a really important player. I think you've seen him even have some huge blocks lately, which is interesting to see and kind of heartening, because he's not a natural rim protector at all, and he's not the biggest guy.
It's because he covers, because he actually runs and he covers the rim. Like he's extremely good at providing help defense. He may not always get the block, but his presence is always there. So I think he's a pretty good player.
He's a good player, and I think he's been a poor rebounder over the course of his career, but the effort is there now, I think, more than it ever has been in terms of him hitting the glass, and that's a positive too.
So this small ball lineup that KC plays, Patterson's been a big part of that. In fact, Kyle Lowry, despite missing like 6 games now, is still the leading minutes getter for the Raptors by like 400,
right.
which is insane. And number 2 behind him is Patrick Patterson, because Dwane Casey really sees him as a fluid player who can play in pretty much any lineup.
And he stayed healthy.
And he stayed healthy. What do you think of going small against the Washington Wizards? Do you think that's a viable strategy? So picture a lineup of perhaps Tyler Hansbrough, who had a great game against Boston, by the way. Tyler Hansbrough, Patrick Patterson, James Johnson, DeMar DeRozan, and Kyle Lowry. Or you can replace Hansbrough with Amir Johnson in that lineup, going against the Washington starting 5. Do you see that working, or do you see us getting killed on the boards there?
Well, Hansbrough's a great rebounder. I don't know they necessarily get killed on the boards, but I mean, if the Wizards have Nene and Gortat in there, then you might get killed on the boards. I think it depends kind of what Washington does. And Wittman all season long has had the habit of taking Gortat out of the game in the fourth quarter and not.
Why is that? Why does he do that?
Well, a lot of Washington fans ask that question.
Replace Gortat with JV, and you get the same question on the Raptors side.
Right. Yeah. And I think obviously, Nene is quicker than he's given credit for, but he's not necessarily able to guard the quickest of the quick guys that play the 4 and the most athletic guys. And Gortat is not the most mobile big man in the world. He's not a stiff, but I think they kind of have a tough time dealing with those small lineups. And I think if the Raptors can get them to take Gortat off the floor, then I think that helps, because Gortat on the other end is a really good, screener, finisher, offensive rebounder, does a lot of little things for that team and can score for that team too. So yeah, it's interesting. I think the lineup that you said might have some spacing issues, just because if you're playing Johnson and DeRozan and Hansbrough, you have 3 non-3-point shooters out there. Though, we've seen DeRozan hit some threes, and we've even seen Hansbrough back in the preseason stretch out there. I don't think they trust him to do that in the playoffs. But there's some spacing issues there. I think you probably want a bit more shooting for long stretches if you're going small, because that's kind of the point, right? But yeah, I think they'll definitely use lineups like that. They will definitely go small, and they'll make Washington try to scramble defensively, because that's when Washington kind of gets in trouble.
Yeah, the reason I asked that question is because I just know 100% that that's the type of lineups that's going to decide the series, because eventually Jonas Valanciunas, as good as he has been, will see the pine, because Dwane Casey prefers basically giving up size for a more mobile defense. Whether it's been effective, obviously it hasn't been, but if there's one thing, he stuck to that. And earlier we talked about any changes Dwane Casey might make to the defense. I agree with you. He's not gonna make drastic changes. So lineups like these are going to be quite common. So let's switch to some non-Raptor talk. Just get your take on the NBA before we let you go. East. Cleveland finally has corrected itself, as we all thought, after a slow start. They're at 49 wins, probably going to hit 50. Things are okay there. They're not going to get the number 1 seed, but does it really matter? Who do you see coming out of the East, assuming Derrick Rose maybe even comes back?
I think it's tilted a bit too far in Cleveland's favor. I think most people now think the Cavs, they've obviously played fantastic ball recently, but I think the idea that they have LeBron, so they will beat Atlanta just based on the fact that they have the best player in this series, is sort of simplifying it. I love what Atlanta's done all season. I think if those two teams play, that will be a long and exciting and really, really close series. And if it was starting today, I'd probably actually pick the Hawks. Not that I have any problem with people picking Cleveland. I mean, the way that they've grown, the way that they've come together since they've made the roster moves that they've made has been, you can say it's been anticipated and everybody thought it would happen, but they still had to actually do that work, and they still had to actually put things together. And it's not just as simple as they're out-talenting teams. I think they've actually grown a lot as a team over the course of the season, and they get credit for that. But I think Atlanta's going to put a lot of pressure on every team that they play, and I don't really buy that, at the end of games they're not going to be able to figure it out. They're unproven. We just don't know how good Atlanta's going to be in the playoffs, but we just don't know that Cleveland's going to be able to put it together in the playoffs too, because a lot of those guys, a couple of their best players have never played in the postseason before. So I think that is a very, very close series. If that is indeed what happens, Chicago might get in the mix and screw that up for everybody. But to me, I'm picking the Hawks by a hair.
Switching to the West, the 1-8 series, which was primed, Golden State versus OKC, doesn't have the attraction it probably once did with Durant out. That probably was being talked about as a potential upset for the 8 seed, but with Durant out,
that would have been incredible.
Yeah, you see anything happening there that might threaten Golden State?
You can't totally count out the team if Ibaka's back and healthy and playing like an all-star and Westbrook keeps doing what he's doing, but I couldn't pick the Thunder. Yeah. They might not even get in. The Pelicans are right there too. But I think Golden State, it's weird to say this because there's been so much written about this team and so much talk about this team, and they probably have the MVP and the Coach of the Year and the Defensive Player of the Year all on the same team. But I'm not even sure that we properly appreciate just how dominant the Warriors have been this year. Their point differential is insane. They're blowing out other really good teams. This is a historically good basketball team we're watching, and the way that they're doing it on both ends while playing at the insanely fast pace they have. They're the most fun team. They're the best team. They're the most compelling team. I would be shocked if they were upset in the first round, and I think they should be the clear favorites to win the title too.
So before we get to Houston, any threats that they might pose with Dwight Howard returning now, let's talk about the Spurs. They're the 6th seed right now. Right now the matchup says Memphis, but just things are so fluid there that you got 6 teams separated by basically 2 games.
Yeah.
Anything can happen, but from a Spurs perspective, do they even care if they're not don't have home court for the first round? Do you against Memphis, do you see any problems with the Spurs?
I think Memphis is terrified of facing the Spurs. I think that's the one matchup they really don't want. Look, the way you can't look at the Spurs overall record, and I could say that for most years. But this year in particular, they were so banged up for the start of the season, and Kawhi Leonard really has evolved into their best player and is basically playing like a superstar now. The defense he's playing is unbelievable, and he's a better, more skilled offensive player than he's probably been given credit for. To me, they're the second best team in the West. I don't think it really matters if they finish 6th. It's such a weird thing in the West where we've seen the Grizzlies look unstoppable. We've seen the Clippers offense look absolutely amazing. The Spurs over the last little while have been dominant and basically the same as they were last year, except Leonard's better. The Rockets might be the best story because of how they've survived a million injuries, and especially the Howard stuff. But yeah, I think looking at just the landscape of the West and looking at who at their peak is going to be the best on both ends, I think the Warriors are the favorite, and then the Spurs are kind of right there. Yeah. And a series against Memphis could easily go 7 games. They went 7 with Dallas in the first round last year, and then went on to just dominate most of the rest of the way. So it's not like they can take the Grizzlies lightly, but I'm still kind of on that. I need to see it. I need to see somebody actually stop the Spurs.
Give me your West Finals.
The Spurs, if they finish 6th right now, they could be right there in the finals against Golden State. That's what I would probably pick.
And just finally, what about the Houston Analytics? They're second in the West right now. They've got this playoff voodoo thing going on where they just can't seem to perform in the playoffs. Now with Harden, MVP candidate, still a poor defender. Dwight Howard coming back, Chandler Parsons, all that happening. Sorry, not Chandler Parsons. He's in Dallas. Do you see them posing any sort of threat in terms of coming out of the West?
I think they're a completely different team than they were last year. The identity of the team has changed. It's not just that Harden is now this more all-around player, and he is. I think the main thing that's happened there is they've become one of the best defensive teams in the NBA, and they just weren't there last year. And the fact that they've done that with Howard out for most of the year is astonishing. And now that he's back and he's getting some reps in before the playoffs start, I think they're very dangerous. And what Morey said when they lost to the Blazers was that they can't really be taken seriously as a championship contender until they have an elite defense, right? Because they couldn't get the stops they needed. They had a bunch of close games. I mean, that series against Portland was awesome, and that could have gone either way. And it's not like Portland dominated that series. I mean, but they were, if I recall, they were all close. And the Rockets lost on a buzzer beater. Yeah. They could have had that series. They could have been a threat in the second round. And I think now that they have a better defense, if the offense is able to take a leap, now that they can run Harden, Howard pick and rolls whenever they want, then they should be taken seriously as a threat, and they should be considered more dangerous than they were last year. Even though if you look at just the roster on paper, they were more talented last year with Parsons and the team that they had then. All
right, so I think we'll leave it at James, man. Thanks for coming on, talking some Raptors. So one day maybe you'll discover that you're a Raptor fan at heart. The day will come soon enough.
If you say so.
So enjoy the playoffs, man. We'll talk to you during the playoffs, maybe once the Raptors hopefully beat the Wizards. Give me a series call before you go. Give me a series call. Wizards.
I'll say Raptors in 6.
All right, sounds good.
What would you say? I want to know your call.
I think one of our writers, William Liu, tweeted something from the main account. It said the key to being a Raptors fan is to have no expectations whatsoever. That's the only way to go. So okay. I'm going to say Wizards in 6. I just don't see the Raptors closing things out. At their home court. I just don't see that happening. But I'll say Wizards in 6.
Toronto fan. The other shoe was always about to drop. That is the mentality of a Raptor fan.
There was a big debate on the last pod, and just give me your 10-second call on before I let you go. Would you rather face Washington or Milwaukee if you're the Raptors?
I'd rather face Washington. I would be scared of Milwaukee's defense and length and the Jason Kidd voodoo again. I would just feel a lot more comfortable going up against the Wizards, even if they kind of have been the better team for most of the season, and they have these stars in the backcourt. I think the Raptors have proven that they match up pretty well with them, and I'm not sure the same can be said against Milwaukee, even though there was that 40-point win or whatever it was early in the season against a very different Milwaukee team than they are now.
All right, James, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.